The chandelier above the east lawn threw gold light across white tablecloths, and Desmond Prescott knelt in the grass beside the iron gate, hands black with grease, tightening a hinge that had groaned for 100 years. A guest in a tuxedo flicked the last of his wine toward him, laughing, and 2 others joined in. Bradford Kessler crossed the lawn in 3 sharp strides. "Get this man off the property before the guests see him," he said, not lowering his voice. Desmond rose slowly, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked past Kessler's shoulder at the bronze plaque bolted into the gatepost. He said nothing. Somewhere behind him, a string quartet kept playing. 6 hours earlier, the kitchen smelled like burnt toast, and Desmond was laughing about it, scraping the black edges into the sink, while Poppy sat on the counter swinging her feet, her socks not quite matching. "Did Mom like burnt toast?" she asked, out of nowhere, the way children ask the biggest questions in the smallest voices. He paused, knife still in his hand, and thought about how to answer it honestly without making the kitchen too heavy to stand in. "She liked it a little burnt," said. The crunch woke her up. "I like it a little burnt, too." "I know you do." He set a new piece in front of her, this one golden at the edges instead of black, and she ate it anyway, satisfied, kicking her heels against the cabinet in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the question she'd just asked and everything to do with being 8 years old and trusting her father to carry the rest. Their rental house sat on the edge of Savannah, close enough to hear the trolley bell on quiet mornings, far enough that no one who mattered ever drove past it. Desmond had lived there 3 years, since the accident, since the funeral, since he'd started taking every contract job that came with a toolbox and asked no questions about his last name. It suited him. A man could disappear behind a tool belt in a way he couldn't behind a suit, and disappearing, for a while, had felt like the only decent thing left to do. He kept a photograph of Poppy's mother taped inside the truck's glove box, not on the dash where it might catch a stranger's eye, and every morning before he turned the key, he touched 2 fingers to the corner of it the way other men touched a rosary or a rabbit's foot. It wasn't superstition exactly. It was closer to reporting for duty, a way of telling her, without words, that he was still doing right by their daughter, even in a house he couldn't put either of their names on. Today's job was the last one on a 6-month contract restoration work on the wrought iron at Larkspur Hall, finishing the same evening as the estate's 100th anniversary gala. He'd requested the east gate specifically over every other section of fence on the property. None of the crew who worked beside him ever thought to ask why one gate mattered more than the others. He never gave them a reason to. He dropped Poppy at his sister-in-law Carol's house on the way, promised he'd be back before her bedtime, and drove out to the estate with his tools rattling loose in the truck bed. The grounds were already swarming by the time he arrived, caterers hauling folding tables across the grass, florists arguing over where the arch should stand, extension cords taped down along every gravel path in sight, a valet crew practicing turns in the driveway for cars that hadn't arrived yet. Somewhere near the tent, a string quartet tuned their instruments against the noise of a generator being tested twice, then a third time. In the middle of all of it moved a woman with a headset and a clipboard, who seemed to be the only person on the property who knew precisely what needed to happen next. That was Everly Danvers. She had been the trust's lead counsel for 11 months, and tonight was the first event she was running entirely on her own, which meant she noticed everything: every folding chair set 2 inches too far from its neighbor, every vendor running 10 minutes behind, and the man kneeling at the east gate with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and a toolbox open beside him like he'd been born with one hand in it. "You're the hinge guy," she said, passing him with a tray of centerpieces balanced against one hip. "That's the job description," Desmond said, without looking up. "Just make sure it's finished before 6. Mr. Kessler wants that gate photographed for the anniversary spread." She didn't slow down to hear his answer, already moving toward the tent where a delivery truck had double parked in the loading lane. "It'll be done," he said, mostly to the hinge. She didn't ask his name. He didn't offer it. It was the kind of exchange that happened a dozen times a day between people who shared the same property and never crossed the same room, the contractor and the lawyer. Nothing more, and neither of them thought, in that moment, to wonder if there should be more. From the shade of the carriage house, Otis Merriweather watched the whole exchange without moving a muscle. He was 71 years old, had oiled the hinges on that gate as a younger man for Desmond's grandfather, and had buried 2 Prescotts without ever being permitted to say to a soul who they had truly been to that house. In his breast pocket, worn soft at the corners from 6 years of handling, sat an envelope he could no longer avoid. He did not cross the lawn to Desmond. Not yet. There was a clause for that, and clauses, in Otis's long experience, did not bend for a man's nerves, however tired those nerves had grown. He had served 3 generations of that family, first as a boy running errands for Desmond's great-grandfather, then as the only man in the house who still remembered where every original blueprint was filed, and in all that time he had learned exactly one unbendable rule. A promise made to a dying man was not a suggestion, no matter how much easier the world would be if it were. By 4 o'clock the gate hinge moved without a sound, and Desmond stood back to study his work, the way he studied everything he built for that house, like a man visiting a grave he wasn't yet allowed to put his own name on. Everly, meanwhile, had already moved through 3 more crises that afternoon: a caterer's delivery gone to the wrong address, a florist threatening to walk off over a disagreement about the arch, and a state senator's office calling twice to confirm parking, and had solved each one with the same unhurried efficiency, the kind that made people trust her without quite noticing they'd started to. The estate's archive room sat behind a door most of the staff assumed led to a supply closet. Everly found the real key by accident, chasing down a missing appraisal document an hour before the gala doors opened, and let herself into a narrow room, lined with filing cabinets that smelled of dust and cedar, and decades of undisturbed paper. Most of the drawers held exactly what she expected: deeds, insurance riders, maintenance logs going back further than she could easily read in the dim light. One cabinet, at the very back of the room, was locked, and stenciled across its face in fading gold paint were 2 words that stopped her hand mid-reach: Prescott Family Trust. She was still working the drawer when Otis stepped into the doorway, filling it entirely despite not being a large man in any obvious way. "That one's not part of tonight's inventory," he said. "I just need the appraisal file. It should be in one of these. That drawer isn't for tonight. It isn't for any night but one." He didn't move to physically stop her. He didn't need to. Something in his voice did the work for him. There's a line in the founding trust. Says that cabinet only opens in front of the full board on the night of the 100th anniversary, and only if the rightful heir is standing in the room to see it opened. Everly frowned, straightening. The rightful heir. There's no heir listed anywhere in the sale file. The Prescott line went cold in the 80s. That's what the documents I've been reviewing say, word for word. Documents say a great many things, Otis said, and eased the door shut behind her, gently, the way a man closes a door on a room he isn't ready to walk back into himself just yet. She stood in the hallway a moment, turning the phrase over, unable to set it down. The rightful heir. She ran through the guest list in her head: board members, donors, 2 state senators, a hotel executive named Ridgemont, who checked his watch more than he spoke, and none of them fit a locked cabinet with a dead family's name stenciled across it in gold. It did not occur to her, not once, to picture the man kneeling at the east gate 300 feet away, because nothing about mud-streaked jeans and a borrowed toolbox said Prescott to her. It said nothing at all. That, in fact, had been the entire design of the last 6 years. Outside, through the archive room's single narrow window, a shape lingered in the gravel a beat longer than it should have. Desmond stood there, looking through the glass at the cabinet he had never once been permitted to open, before turning and walking back toward the gate, as though nothing about the moment had cost him anything at all. He didn't tell Otis he'd seen him through the glass. Otis didn't tell him what he'd said to the lawyer. Some conversations, in that house, were still not permitted to happen out loud, and both men had grown practiced at carrying their halves of the silence separately. Poppy found her father near the hedge line just after 5, breathless from running the length of the lawn in her good shoes. "Dad." She grabbed his hand with both of hers, tugging. "Is this the house Grandma used to tell me about? The one with the lions on the gate?" Desmond looked down at his daughter, then up at the stone lions flanking the entrance, worn smooth by 100 years of rain and hands. "Go find your Aunt Carol," he said. "She's got the good seats saved." Poppy studied him a second longer, the way children do when they know full well they haven't gotten a real answer, then ran off toward the tent, and her question left standing in the grass behind her like something neither of them was ready to pick up just yet. Bradford Kessler kept a private study on the 2nd floor of the carriage house, and by Tuesday afternoon it was crowded with 4 board members, and the smell of scotch poured too early in the day for anyone's good judgment. Ridgemont wants signatures by the anniversary, Kessler said, sliding a folder across the desk toward the nearest board member. Full hotel conversion, top-to-bottom renovation, and every one of you gets a line in the press release calling you a visionary for saving this place instead of letting it rot. All we need is a clean board vote before anyone starts asking questions about old paperwork nobody's looked at in decades. What old paperwork? One member asked, not looking up from his coffee. Nothing that concerns us, Kessler said, a beat too quickly, and moved the conversation along before anyone could linger on the question. The point is, gentlemen, this estate has cost the trust more in upkeep than it's returned in donations for 6 years running. Ridgemont is offering us a way out that doesn't end with this place falling down around a handful of nostalgic board members. I'd think you'd all be thanking me. One of the older members shifted in his seat, uneasy but unwilling to say why, and the folder made its way around the table without another word of objection. Down the hall, Everly sat with the trust's financial ledgers spread across a conference table, cross-referencing 3 years of maintenance draws against the foundation's reported balance sheet. The numbers didn't quite meet in the middle. $18,000, give or take, seemed to have gone missing somewhere between the invoice stage and the final accounting. She brought it to Kessler that afternoon, the ledger open to the page in question. He barely glanced at it. Rounding, he said, waving a hand. Old accounting software, that's all it ever is with these legacy systems. Fix the formula if it bothers you. He closed the folder before she could show him the second discrepancy she'd flagged, and something in the speed of it stayed with her longer than the missing number itself did. Outside, Desmond spent the day on the West Wing shutters, replacing rotted wood with cuts he'd measured twice, the way his grandfather had taught him before he was old enough to understand why a man would care so much about a house that would never, on paper, to be his to keep. He worked with his sleeves rolled and his radio off, listening instead to the sounds of the house itself, pipes settling, wind moving through the eaves, footsteps on gravel that told him, without needing to look up, exactly who was approaching. Around noon, Everly crossed the lawn with 2 bottles of water and handed him one without any real explanation for why she'd bothered. You've been out here every day for 6 months, she said, wiping sweat from her hairline with the back of her wrist. Doesn't the heat get to you eventually? Southern summers build character, he said. Or heat stroke. Jury's still out on which. She almost smiled at that, catching herself halfway. What did you do before this? Contracting? I mean, is that always what you did? Worked with my hands mostly, one way or another. You? Paperwork mostly. She looked toward the gate instead of at him. Guess we're both just doing our jobs out here. Neither of them asked the obvious follow-up. It sat there between them, easy enough to reach and left untouched, the way it had every single day since the first time they'd spoken. He didn't tell her his last name carried more weight in that town than her law degree ever would. She didn't tell him she'd begun to suspect the man signing her paychecks was hiding something behind a folder he wouldn't let her finish reading. They talked about the garden instead, about how the wisteria needed cutting back before it choked the trellis entirely, and for 10 unhurried minutes, neither of them carried anything they were required to carry alone. That night, after Poppy was asleep, Desmond sat at the kitchen table with the estate's original blueprints spread out in front of him, tracing the outline of a house he'd been paid to fix and forbidden, for now, to claim. He thought about telling someone, Everly, the board, anyone at all, that the man running the sale had no real idea what he was actually selling. Then he thought about the clause, folded the blueprints back into their sleeve, and put the whole matter away for the night. Otis found Desmond behind the carriage house on a Thursday evening, the light going long and orange across the lawn in a way that made everything look older than it was. Your father made me promise something before he died, Otis said, without preamble, the way old men do when they've carried a sentence too long to soften it now. Said the name doesn't come out until the anniversary night, in front of the full board, with you standing in the room to see it. Not before. Not for convenience, not even to stop something you can see coming from a mile off. And if I don't wait, then the fallback clause kicks in. Control reverts to whoever's chairing the board that night, clean and legal, no way back from it. Otis's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed somewhere past Desmond's shoulder. Your father wrote it that way on purpose, said if you couldn't hold your tongue for one house, You didn't deserve to hold the deed to it either. Desmond looked toward the gate, toward the gravel path where Everly's car sat parked, toward everything in that yard that could still be lost if he moved even a single day too soon. He always did think silence was its own kind of proof, Desmond said quietly. He was usually right about that. Desmond looked down at his own hands, still stained faintly with the day's work. I watch her walk that lawn every day not knowing what she's about to lose, Otis. Feels like letting a friend walk toward a hole in the floor. She's not your friend to protect yet, Otis said, not unkindly. She's a woman doing her job the best way she knows how. Give the truth its night, and let it do the protecting for you. That weekend, Poppy helped her father plant a small bed of crepe myrtle by the east gate, the same soft pink her mother had always kept in a vase on the kitchen table. Desmond dug the holes. Poppy dropped the roots in with both hands, patting the soil down with more determination than skill, dirt working its way under every fingernail. Mom would like these, she said, not looking up from her work. She would. He watched his daughter dig, dirt streaked clean across one cheek, and felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in weeks. Whatever else that house cost him before the year was through. This, her hands in the dirt, her voice steady and sure of something as simple as flowers, was worth more than any name that might ever be carved onto a plaque. Inside, Everly stayed late reviewing the sale contract line by line, hunting for the source of the missing $18,000. She found nothing conclusive, only a persistent, low hum of wrongness she couldn't yet put a name to. When Kessler passed her office and saw the ledgers still spread open across her desk, his voice dropped into something colder than the charm he usually wore in public. "You're a sharp lawyer, Miss Danvers. Sharp enough, I'd think, to know which questions keep a person employed." He didn't wait for a response before pulling her office door shut behind him. She sat alone with that sentence for a long time after he left, the ledgers glowing pale under the desk lamp. The dress rehearsal for the anniversary gala filled the lawn with caterers' testing lights and a string quartet running scales beneath the oaks. Kessler walked the grounds with a checklist clenched in one hand, snapping at anyone who moved slower than he wanted. And when he reached the east gate, he stopped in front of Desmond just long enough to say, "Staff, stay off the guest paths tonight. All of you. I don't want anyone mistaking a work crew for company." Desmond nodded once and kept his eyes on the hinge. An hour later, a guest arriving early for the walkthrough, a donor's son in a linen jacket, half a drink already working through him, stopped at the gate to watch Desmond finish the last bolt. "You people ever get tired of fixing things you'll never own?" the young man said, grinning at his own joke like it deserved an audience. "This isn't really a place for your kind, you know. Not even to work it, if you ask me." Desmond didn't look up. He kept the wrench moving, steady, unhurried, the same rhythm he'd have used if the man hadn't spoken at all. It cost him something to hold that stillness more than the young man would ever understand, but he'd learned a long time ago that certain insults answered themselves better in silence than in argument. The young man laughed once more, waiting for a reaction that never came, then wandered off toward the bar tent when it became clear he wasn't going to get one. A caterer nearby had gone quiet mid-stride, watching, and quickly found somewhere else to be needed. Everly saw it from the terrace, saw the smirk, saw Desmond's shoulders, saw the whole shape of the moment settle over the lawn, and something in her chest went tight and airless. She had no real authority to intervene, not as staff, not as a guest, not as anyone whose job title carried weight over a donor's son with a drink in his hand. So she did the only thing available to her. She waited 20 minutes, then walked out with 2 cups of coffee and set one down beside him without a word, and walked away again before he could thank her for it. He watched her go, coffee steaming between his hands, and thought that of everyone who had crossed that lawn in 6 months, she was the only one who had ever apologized to him with an action instead of a sentence. That night, long after the last car had pulled away, Otis stayed behind in the archive room, checking the financial binders against the master ledger one final time before the anniversary. Page after page, the numbers came back clean. Then, tucked behind a maintenance invoice from 3 years back, he found a single sheet that didn't belong a photocopy, not an original, its signature block set at an angle that matched nothing filed around it. He sat with it a long time under the desk lamp, the house silent around him, and understood, with a weight that settled slow and heavy in his chest, that whatever Kessler was building toward had started long before this particular week. Later that same night, after the archive room had gone dark and the last of the staff had gone home, a single lamp clicked back on behind the locked door. The security camera mounted above the hallway caught only a shape shoulders, a hand pulling drawers open one after another, the outline of someone working fast in a room they had no clear business entering after hours. The face never once turned toward the lens. By morning, the footage would sit unwatched in a folder no one had reason to open yet. Marion Teague ran the city archive 2 blocks off Bull Street, and she had not thought about Larkspur Hall in years until a small notice about its 100th anniversary ran in the local paper's Sunday section. She'd worked alongside Desmond's grandfather for the better part of a decade, cataloging estate records long before anyone thought to digitize any of it, and something about the notice, the phrasing, the vague mention of renewed stewardship sat wrong with her all week, in a way she couldn't quite shake. She called the trust's office and asked plainly for whoever was handling the sale paperwork directly. She got Everly. "I have something you'll want to see before that gala," Marion said over the phone. "It belonged to the man who built the place. I think somebody's been telling a story that doesn't match his math, and I'd rather that somebody wasn't me who noticed too late." They met the next afternoon in a small reading room, lined with old maps. Marion set a cracked leather ledger on the table between them, its pages brittle and covered edge to edge in a cramped, careful hand, the founder's own bookkeeping, decades before any board had ever existed to argue over a single line of it. Everly turned the pages slowly, matching dates against the modern financial records still open on her laptop screen beside it. The founder's numbers didn't just fail to match Kessler's current reporting, they contradicted an entire section of the trust's founding structure. A section that, according to the ledger's own careful handwriting, had never granted any board the authority to sell the estate outright at all. That authority belonged, explicitly and repeatedly, to a single bloodline the ledger named on nearly every page it contained. Prescott. Everly sat back slowly in her chair, the name settling into place like a key finally turning. She thought of the locked cabinet. She thought of Otis's voice in the archive doorway, careful and immovable. She thought, though she resisted it at first, of a man at the East Gate who never once answered a personal question with more than a single sentence, who watched that property the way most people only watch something they've already lost once and can't afford to lose again. "You knew him," Everly said finally, quiet. "The grandfather. What was he like?" Marion considered the question longer than it seemed to need. "Careful," she said at last. "Careful with people, careful with paper, kept every promise he ever made, even the small ones nobody would have held him to. I imagine that's a hard thing to hand down to a family, being careful like that. Harder still to live up to." She didn't say his name out loud, not yet. She wasn't ready to be wrong about it, or somehow, even less ready to be right. That evening she stood in front of her bathroom mirror far longer than she meant to, the founder's ledger still clutched in one hand, and understood, with a cold and sinking clarity, that every signature she had placed on the sale documents over the past 11 months had been building, however unknowingly, toward handing someone else's inheritance to a stranger in a suit. She hadn't known any of it. That didn't make her hands feel any cleaner in the mirror's light. The night of the 100th anniversary arrived, dressed in string lights and white orchids, every board member present, 2 state senators trading small talk near the fountain, and a Ridgemont executive checking his watch like a man who had already spent the money in his head twice over. Kessler moved through the crowd with a rehearsed ease, working his way steadily toward the small stage set up near the terrace, where a single table held the final sale agreement and a pen laid across it like a prop waiting for its cue. Desmond arrived in a suit none of the waitstaff recognized, walked past the gate he had spent 6 months repairing without once stopping to look at it, and took up a position at the very back of the room. Otis met him there, pressed the worn envelope into his hands, and said nothing further. There was nothing left to explain that the envelope wouldn't say better than either of them could. Across the room, Everly caught sight of him, and went completely still. It wasn't the suit that stopped her. It was the profile, the jaw, the brow. The particular set of the shoulders matched almost exactly to a photograph pressed between 2 pages of the founder's ledger, a portrait dated nearly a century back and labeled, in fading ink, with a name she now recognized on sight. Her pulse climbed hard and fast. She searched the room for Otis, found him already watching her from across the crowd, and understood, in the space of a single breath, exactly how much of this night had been arranged around a truth she had only just finished assembling for herself. Kessler took the stage, tapped the microphone twice, and smiled out at the crowd like a man already counting a bonus that hadn't cleared yet. "Tonight, Larkspur Hall enters its next 100 years, he said, his voice carrying easily over the terrace, "and I am honored to invite our board representative up to finalize an agreement that secures this estate's future for generations to come." He gestured toward the empty chair beside him. The pen sat waiting. The whole tent seemed to lean forward at once, holding its breath along with him. Somewhere near the back, Poppy tugged at her aunt's sleeve, too young to understand the weight settling over the terrace but old enough to feel it, and asked in a whisper why everyone had gone so quiet all at once. Before Kessler could lift the pen from the table, Otis stepped through the crowd and up onto the edge of the stage, his voice carrying with an authority no one in that tent had ever heard from him before, not in 6 years of quiet service. "There's a clause in this trust's founding document," he said, "older than any contract on that table tonight. It says the rightful heir must stand in this room, on this exact night, before anyone signs away what was never theirs to sign." The crowd's murmur died into a silence thick enough to hear the fountain running. Desmond walked forward, unhurried, and set the envelope's contents on the table beside the sale agreement, a birth certificate, the original trust seal, a will bearing a signature the older members of the board would recognize on sight without needing it explained to them. He didn't raise his voice once. He let the paper do what 6 months of silence had never once been permitted to do on its own. Everly stepped up beside him, with the founder's ledger open in both hands. "The appendix Mr. Kessler has been using to justify this sale," she said. Her voice, steady though her pulse was not, was fabricated. "I've matched the signature block to nothing in this trust's original filings. The board never had the authority to sell this property outright. It never once left the Prescott line." Kessler's composure cracked in real time in front of the entire crowd. First the smile faltered, then the color drained from his face, then the steadiness of his voice gave way entirely as he reached for an explanation that kept slipping further out of his grasp. "There's some kind of administrative error here. That's all this could possibly be. I can have it corrected by morning." Nobody in the tent was listening to him anymore. His own voice had already testified against him more thoroughly than either Otis or Everly ever could have. The board called an emergency vote before the terrace lights had even finished flickering back to full brightness. 9 votes to remove Kessler from every position he held within the trust. 2 abstentions. Control of Larkspur Hall passed, formally and permanently, back into the hands of the only family whose name had ever truly belonged on that gate. One of the older board members, the same man who'd shifted uneasily in his seat days earlier, over a folder he'd been too polite to question, crossed the terrace and shook Desmond's hand without a word, as if an apology could be offered that way, quietly, hand to hand, without either man needing to name what it was for. In the noise that followed, reporters from the local station scrambling for whatever footage they could manage, board members talking over one another in a dozen overlapping conversations, Kessler being quietly walked toward the parking lot by 2 men, who did not look like they were there for the party. Poppy broke free of her aunt's hand and ran the full length of the terrace, straight through the scattering crowd, and threw both arms around her father's waist. A camera caught it without meaning to. By morning, the image, a little girl in a rumpled dress hugging a man in a borrowed suit, the whole tent frozen in motion behind them, had traveled across every local feed in Savannah. By the next morning, state financial investigators had already opened a file on Bradford Kessler, and the Preservation Board voted unanimously to suspend him from every remaining position he still technically held. The $18,000 Everly had first flagged turned out to be the smallest thread of a much longer pattern, one stretching back nearly 4 years, and several forged signatures deep, each one more brazen than the last. Everly drove out to Larkspur Hall that afternoon, not as the trust's attorney, not with a clipboard or a headset clipped to her hip, but as a woman carrying an apology she didn't quite know how to phrase out loud yet. She found Desmond in the garden, kneeling by the crepe myrtle bed, and knelt down beside him without asking permission, pulling weeds from around the roots while he worked in comfortable silence a few feet away. "I signed those sale documents," she finally said, not looking up from the dirt. "I should have asked more questions before I did." "You asked the right ones eventually," Desmond said. That's more than most people ever manage, in my experience. They didn't discuss it any further than that. The work spoke for both of them instead, her hands in the same dirt his daughter had turned over weeks earlier, the two of them clearing space around something that had almost been lost for good. Poppy ran out from the porch with a single crepe myrtle blossom pinched carefully between two fingers and held it up to Everly like an offering that mattered more than its size suggested. "This is for you," she said, "since you helped save the house." "Thank you," Everly said, and something in her chest ached in a way she hadn't quite expected it to. "You're welcome, Miss Everly." Otis watched from the carriage house steps, arms crossed, the late afternoon sun warm across his face for the first time in longer than he could easily remember. It was the first evening in 6 years he could recall standing on that lawn without the weight of an unkept promise still resting on his shoulders. He allowed himself, finally, a small and entirely private smile, one he didn't bother explaining to anyone who might have seen it. Later, he walked the length of the property alone, checking each hinge and each lock the way he had every evening for decades. Only this time there was nothing left to guard against, and the checking felt less like duty and more like habit he was allowed, at last, to enjoy for its own sake. Within the month, the Preservation Board reorganized under new oversight, with the Prescott family holding formal authority over the estate's future for the first time in nearly 40 years. Everly was asked to stay on as permanent legal counsel to the trust not by whoever replaced Kessler, but by Desmond himself, in a conversation that lasted exactly 4 sentences and ended with a handshake neither of them let go of quite as quickly as the moment strictly required. Weeks later, Larkspur Hall opened its gates to the public for the first time as what it had always been meant to be a piece of the city's own history, preserved rather than sold off, its rooms filled with visitors instead of investors counting square footage. Desmond stood at the east gate, the same iron he had knelt beside on the night he was told to leave his own family's property, like a stranger who'd wandered in uninvited. A new plaque had been set into the stone beside it, the family name cut clean and deep into the bronze, meant to outlast every hand that would ever come to touch it after his own. Everly came to stand beside him, and neither of them spoke right away. The silence between them held more than either had managed to put into words across 6 months of coffee cups and half-finished sentences, of questions neither had asked and answers neither had, until now, needed. Visitors moved past them in 2s and 3s, reading the new plaque, admiring the restored ironwork without knowing what it had cost the man standing quietly beside it to earn the right to stand there at all. Poppy ran past them through the crepe myrtle in full pink bloom, laughing at nothing in particular, her voice carrying easily across the lawn the way laughter does in a garden that has finally stopped waiting for something bad to happen inside it. Everly's hand found the iron rail beside Desmond's, close enough that their fingers brushed against each other, and neither of them pulled away. The gate had never really been locked. It had only been waiting for the right hand to open it.